So some of you of a certain maturity and age might remember a guy named Roddy Piper, who was a professional wrestler in the 1980s, one of the greats. And he died around the time I started working on this book. And he's most famous for, other than the wrestling stuff, he was, one of his great acting debuts was in a movie called They Live, which is a John Carpenter sci-fi kind of thriller. The most famous line from that is, "I came here today to do two things, chew gum and kick ass, and I'm all out of gum." So I've probably seen, since that movie came out, I've probably seen it, carry the one, 4,000 times, right? It was one of those classic kind of movies that if you had a bad hangover in college, you could turn on and then fall asleep to, and it'd be okay. And for years, I watched it, I liked it, it's sort of campy B movie, sci-fi kind of thing. And I had no idea that, until much more recently, that it's considered literally, and I don't mean literally the way Joe Biden means literally, which is figuratively, it is considered literally the greatest Marxist film ever made. And I'm not exaggerating. I'll just give you one example. A guy named Christos Kefalos, writing in dissident voice. I'm sure you're all subscribers. It's a radical newsletter in the struggle for peace and social justice. He said that They Live is the Marxist movie par excellence. He added that it is, quote, "one of the most devastating and sharp criticisms of American imperialism ever made, representing in exemplary fashion the process of neoconservative barbarization in American society, as well as the dynamic of its revolutionary overthrow." I missed this entirely. But after reading up on it, they kind of have a point. It is a, if you guys want to find some empty seats around here, or you can make a human pyramid, that'd be fun. If you want to grab some of these chairs, you can too. I'm very gracious with other people's property. So in the movie, the setup is that Roddy Piper plays this sort of bourgeois, hardworking everyman, a little down on his luck. He's had some hard times. And one day he finds a pair of glasses, a pair of sunglasses. And when he puts them on, the true nature of the world around him is revealed. And he sees that the sort of gaudy, colorized world of late industrial capitalism that we live in is in fact a mirage. And when he puts them on, the world gets black and white. And he sees the truth hidden behind all of these things. And so when he sees, for example, a billboard with a beautiful woman in a bikini, and it says, "Come to Barbados," he puts on the glasses, and it says, "Marry and reproduce." When he looks at magazine covers, it says things like "obey" and "conform." And when he looks at certain people, certain rich people, it turns out that they are these hideous, bug-eyed aliens with distorted faces, ghouls. And not to be too uncharitable, look a little bit like the former Congressman Henry Waxman, if you remember him. And so when I was set out to write my book, I really wanted to come up with a similar device, a sort of literary device that sort of revealed the world that's sort of hidden in plain sight behind us. And I didn't, bless you, I didn't do too well with this. My editor did not want me to do an extended metaphor based on the movie They Live. And so instead I borrowed a thought experiment from a guy at Yale. I should back up and say what I'm talking about, what I mean by this hidden world is, one of my big daydreaming kind of projects is I like to look around the world that we see today and ask not what would seem amazing to someone from a smart person from 500 or 1,000 years ago, but what would be recognizable, what would be familiar. I'll give you one example, North Korea, right? We talk about North Korea these days, use phrases like Stalinist or communist or Marxist or dictatorship or authoritarian or socialist and all these kinds of things. And for a time, there was some accuracy to that. But people forget that, or don't know, that the North Korean government yanked all the stuff about Marx out of its official documents decades ago. There's no socialist Marxist Leninist doctrine. There's no, praise of Stalin anymore. That was all yanked out. And what's replaced it is something that would be utterly recognizable in the time of Hammurabi. It's a monarchy. It's not the divine right of kings, it's the divine right of Kims, but it's the same principle, right? For the last 3 generations, you have these dictators there who inherited, at least 2 of them inherited their title from their father, right? It's hereditary, sort of primogeniture kind of monarchical aristocratic inheritance. When the first one was born, according to official state propaganda, he was born up in the mountains, night turns to day, rainbows appear, unicorns, I mean, all this kind of crazy stuff. It's this mythic understanding of where this great lineage comes from. The middle one, reason I'm not saying Kim Jong-un or Kim Jong-il, I always get them confused, but Kim Jong-il, who I believe is the second one, he according to state propaganda, and when I say state propaganda, this is our religious doctrine in North Korea. Of the top 18 symphonies ever composed, he wrote 18 of them. His body was allegedly so efficient he didn't need to use the bathroom. Now, if you do a Google image search of the guy you see does not match up too much with what you would think is the most efficient body in the world, but so be it. I mean, some of the stuff is like straight out of Dr. Evil, right? I mean, like, he didn't say he invented the question mark, but he did say he invented the hamburger. And so they build up this sort of, they turn these people into demigods, which is what lots of rulers were turned into for thousands of years. But it's not just that. It's a full aristocracy. You have people who are descendants by blood of the heroic revolutionaries who fought off the Japanese and the Chinese and all that kind of stuff. They live at the top of society, as will their kids and their grandkids and all of their descendants, so long as they don't mess up. And at the bottom of society, you have serfs and peasants who are essentially slaves, who have to work in slave labor, who only get sort of the trickle-down crusts from society. There are about 53 different castes by blood in North Korea. And it's very difficult to move out of your caste, almost impossible, very easily to be banished down to a lower caste. This sort of social organization was common across Europe, Asia, Africa, since the agricultural revolution. But we want to think of it as some sort of modern thing, when in fact it is a more ancient and stable form of social organization. Another example, I always like to look for how guilds constantly reemerge in the West. The taxi cab medallion business was a guild, a quintessential guild in New York City for decades. Mexican teachers unions in some states in Mexico, jobs are heritable. So literally, if you teach chemistry, you can leave your chemistry teaching job to your kid, regardless of whether they are qualified to teach chemistry. So these things come up. If you look at the way they organize car dealerships in America, it looks a lot like a ducal franchise from like 14th century Europe. So anyway, I wanted to find out some sort of technique to reveal some of this kind of stuff, and I didn't do too well. And so instead, I borrowed this thought experiment from a guy at Yale, and I asked the reader to imagine that they are a visitor from another planet. And their job is to monitor the progress of Homo sapiens on planet Earth, ever since we split off from the Neanderthals, depending on who you ask. Let's say it's 250,000 years ago. Now, I'm sorry I'm drinking so much water. I smoked an enormous amount of pot before I got here, and I get dry mouth. So imagine you're this alien and you come to planet Earth in your spaceship and you take out your notebook and you see these Homo sapiens running around. What would you write in your notebook? Well, you would basically write semi-hairless apes foraging and fighting for food. Part of the trick is you can only come once every 10,000 years. So you come back in 10,000 years and you look down on these Homo sapiens, and what would you write in your notebook? You'd write semi-hairless apes foraging and fighting for food. No change. Come back in 10,000 years. Semi-hairless apes foraging and fighting for food. No change. Now, that's a little unfair because there would be some change in the sense that different populations would migrate, which means they would have different diets. But for the most part, that's a perfectly accurate description for the first 23 times you visit planet Earth. On the 24th time, when you come here, your spaceship will probably be picked up by NORAD. I'm sorry, on the 24th, I apologize. On the 24th time, you would come and you see enormous changes, vast changes. You would see the emergence of agriculture, which brings the first city-states. You would see all sorts of interesting new tools, some really fetching clay pottery. you would see the emergence of this thing that is actually remarkably recent in human history, called the home. This domicile that people lived in year round. Prior to that, human beings were essentially migratory or nomadic. And so you'd be like really psyched to come back for your 25th visit. And on your 25th visit, because I ruined the joke, your spaceship would be picked up by NORAD, and you probably get here just in time to see something like, I don't know, Miley Cyrus twerking at the Super Bowl. Which is to say that virtually all human progress, all the things that we think of as progress, have occurred in the last 10,000 years. But that's misleading. That's sort of like me saying the combined net worth of me and Jeff Bezos is $110 billion, right? It's technically true, but it's leaving out a lot. Because the reality is, almost all of the stuff that we associate with progress has happened in the last 300 years. One of my favorite lines comes from an economic historian, Todd Buchholz, who said, for most of man's life on Earth, he lived no better on 2 legs than he did on 4. The material circumstances of your average British Englishman in, say, 1650 was materially probably no better than your average citizen of the Roman Empire. So change came really slow. In fact, for about 250,000 years, the average human being everywhere in the world, Africa, Asia, South America, North America, was no more than $3 a day. So for 250,000 years, there is literally no such thing as economic growth. And then once and only once, about 300 years ago, it starts to go like this. So among the things that this means, it means that, first of all, poverty is natural. Poverty is our natural condition. That in a state of nature, the plight of a human being is a life of grinding poverty punctuated by an early death, either from violence or for some bowel-stewing disease. And it's like this for 7,500 generations. Never mind the pre-Homo sapien species, most of whose DNA we still have. So another lesson that you get from this is just the simple idea that human nature has no history. That we have the same programming, the same basic wiring that someone from 5,000 or 10,000 or 20,000 years ago did. It also means that capitalism, democracy, human rights, basically everything that we associate with modernity and civilization are not natural. If they were natural, they would have showed up in the evolutionary record a little earlier. If I take a jar of ants and I go to some continent or island or planet that is just like Earth but has no ants, and I dump out the ants on the ants will instantly start doing ant stuff, right? Digging holes, anointing a queen, whatever ants do. I'm not an entomologist, but you get the point. If you could, somehow you could take human beings stripped of all of their education and civilizational norms and could dump them off on a planet or an island, they would turn very rapidly into semi-hairless apes foraging and fighting for food. And so when I say human nature has no history, this means that basically all of the important stuff of civilization is embedded in the ideas and institutions of the civilization that we live in. And so I call this transformation the miracle. I don't call it the Enlightenment. I don't call it, that's what Steven Pinker does. Steven Pinker has got a great book. It's really interesting. It's selling better than my book. I hate him. But it's a really good book, but his whole book can be summarized by the appendix in my book. He charts all of this amazing progress that's happened. Not just material progress, but the elimination, the reduction of bigotry and violence and all sorts of things. And he says it's all because of the Enlightenment. And basically he says anything he likes is the Enlightenment, anything he doesn't like isn't the Enlightenment. There's some problems with this. First of all, there were a lot of Enlightenments. There was the French Enlightenment, which sucked. There was the German Enlightenment, which was not great either. There's American Enlightenment, there's an English or Scottish Enlightenment. And my standard way too glib line sort of borrowed from Mike Myers and So I Married an Axe Murderer. When it comes to Enlightenments, if it's not Scottish, it's crap. So I call it the miracle for a bunch of different reasons. One of the reasons I call it the miracle is because we really don't know how it happened. We have lots of really interesting theories, and I'll talk about that in a second, but there's no consensus. There's an overwhelming consensus from Marxists on over to anarcho-capitalists about the hockey stick part, about poverty for hundreds of thousands of years. everyone basically agrees on that. Where they disagree is why it started to change. Marxists have one theory. Some people say it all had to do with slavery, which I don't think is right. We can talk about that if you like. The most famous theory is Max Weber's the Protestant work ethic and the spirit of capitalism, which people always forget he kind of renounced a couple years after he wrote it. But that argument says that because a bunch of specific Protestant sects, Calvinists, Lutherans, adopted the theological doctrine of predestination, they internalized this idea that if you were the kind of person who looked and acted like the kind of person who would be going into heaven, it might goose the stats a little bit, and you'd actually be going into heaven. It's sort of like dressing for the job you want rather than the job you have of theology. And it turns out that if you do the things that this doctrine called for, be honest in your business dealing, be thrifty, save money, right? Work very, very hard, attend to your family and your community. If you do those things, it turns out, lo and behold, that you're more likely to get rich. The kind of person who honors contracts and stands by their word is going to get better business than someone who breaks it, right? I mean, Donald Trump is an exception to that point, but you get my point. And but the important thing to realize there is that even there, no one planned that. No one said, if we do these things, we'll get rich. This wasn't the prosperity gospel. It was an accidental byproduct of a change of behavior, of habits of the heart, and of putting your faith into action that yielded these differences. Now, that's another reason why I call it the miracle. It was an accident. You can't find anybody from John Locke, and what has two thumbs and likes John Locke, this guy, but you can't find from John Locke or Adam Smith or any of these people someone arguing, well, if we do all of these things, if we organize society in such a way, we'll just get wildly richer and be more prosperous. Even Adam Smith, he wasn't prescribing, he was describing. He was looking at the world around him and explaining how this emergent thing of free market economics worked and why it was a good thing. And so when I say it's an accident, I mean that as a good and glorious thing, right? When something providential, something wonderful happens in our lives that we can't explain, we call it a miracle. Now, I don't call it a miracle because it comes from God. I am totally open to that argument. I've gotten a lot of grief from friends of mine on the religious right for the first sentence of my book, which is, there is no God in this book. Spoiler alert, he kind of sneaks in at the end, but that's a different issue. But the reason why I say there's no God in this book is what I'm trying to do is model behavior that I think is remarkably absent on the right these days. Well, from our politics in general, but I care more about the right, which is to make arguments to try to persuade people who disagree with me. And so I work on the terms that we associate with, I don't know, what you can call it, the left or progressives or secular people or whatever it is, or basically anybody who is not persuadable that God one day, after 250,000 years of humans being on this planet, decided, let's make everybody rich, right? And so I look at the concrete stuff. The people like, the Paul Krugman types say they only care about science and data. They only care about sort of, evolutionary arguments about human nature and all the rest. And so that's what I rely on. Because what I'm trying to do is say, even on your own terms, liberal democratic capitalism is awesome, right? It's not perfect. It's got flaws, and we can talk about that in a minute. But it's better than everything that came before it. And not just because it makes us richer, or that we live longer, or that we live healthier, or that literacy goes through the roof for the first time in human history, or that we have indoor plumbing and sanitation, or that bigotry goes down for the first time in a meaningful way in human history. It's great across a vast spectrum of things that the left claims to care about, right? The left says that when you ask them why do you have the ideology that you have, why do you think government should do the things that it does, the answer is usually they want to improve education and literacy and public health and reduce bigotry, reduce violence, and all of those things liberal democratic capitalism does. And The last reason I call it a miracle is because normally when you're presented with a miracle, you're supposed to be grateful for it. And one of the gravest problems that we have in American life today and in the West today is that we do not practice anything like gratitude for the good things that we have. We literally teach the opposite of gratitude. We teach resentment, we teach entitlement, and you know, one of the things I did was I looked at the stories of the goose that lays the golden egg, right? And the story of the goose that lays the golden egg is the story that says the moral of the story is supposed to be about greed, and I have no problem with that. Fine, it's about greed, but it's about something else too, right? So there are two versions that come into the West in the 14th and 15th century. One's French, one's English. You can never keep straight which one's which. But in one version, a goose waddles into this guy's farm and starts squeezing out a golden egg once a day. And a golden, I haven't done all the inflation-adjusted dollars, but a golden egg was pretty valuable in the 14th century. And he says to the goose, I want 2 eggs a day. And the goose politely says, I'm sorry, I can't do that. I can only give you 1 egg. And the guy gets so full of rage that he strangles the goose and kills it. In the other version, it's this couple, and they get a goose that lays a golden egg. And they use their reason, right? They use their logic. They use their sort of Paul Krugman-like technocratic expertise, and they reverse engineer and deduce that if the goose is laying 1 golden egg a day, it must have a giant lump of gold inside. So they cut it open, killing it, no gold inside. Now again, both stories you can talk about greed, but what they're really talking about is ingratitude. Here's this thing that comes out of nowhere that no one planned, that just beneficially just gives you wealth beyond imagining, and in one version, that it doesn't give you as much as you want, you are full of rage and ingratitude and you kill it. And in the other version, you think you're smarter than the goose. You think you can outthink the goose, right? You think that, you know, if only I had power, I could be in charge and I could do better than what the goose does. And they, in the process, destroy it. Now, I think that these two versions are pretty good metaphors for 2 of the problems that are plaguing us. One is a sort of populist rage that feels like we're owed more than what we're getting. We want to tear everything down and destroy it on this weird assumption that something better will emerge in the ashes. And there's versions of that on the left and on the right. And then the other version is this sort of technocratic hubris that defines a lot of progressives, but also these days more and more sort of nationalists who want a planned economy, who think they're smarter than the market, can outthink the market, and that their perfect little manipulations of the dials and knobs on the economic machine will somehow yield something better than free markets will. And these two forces in our intellectual life, I think, are a product of ingratitude. So where do I think the miracle came from? Well, I mean, look, I could pull a Jeremy Corbyn and start in on the Jews, but the short history is that monotheism was hugely important, Christianity was hugely important, but I'm going to skip ahead and get to what happened 300, 350 years ago, which is what I call the Lockean Revolution. Now, this does not, I name it after John Locke. I could have named it after Adam Smith. I could have named it after a bunch of people. Could have even named it after Montesquieu, though I don't like to say nice things about the French. It is not because John Locke invented it. John Locke represents a change in people's consciousness. And it is this idea that our rights come from God, not from government, that we are citizens, not subjects. The government works for us, we don't work for it. That the individual is sovereign, we are captains of ourselves, and that the fruits of our labors belong to us, which means that for the first time in a meaningful and lasting way in human history, innovation is seen as a good thing. And innovation really is the engine of economic growth. Up until the 1700s in Western Europe, innovation was considered a sin, the sin of curitas, of questioning the established order. And then for just miraculous reasons, some switch goes off in people's heads, and all of a sudden, commerce is seen as a good thing and a valuable thing. Now, these things have happened in other countries before, but the problem is that because innovation is a threat to the established order. Just ask the guys who paid $1.1 million for a taxi cab medallion what they think of Uber, and you'll see what I mean. The political powers that be would always crush it once it became too much of a threat. This was the story of the Republic of Venice. This was the story of what happened in China when they had printing presses and steel hundreds of thousands of years, in some cases, well, hundreds of years earlier than Europeans did, but the powers that be strangled it. They strangled the goose. And this brings me to sort of the second part of my argument. It's this argument about corruption. When we talk about corruption in modern parlance, we mean graft or bribery or how they do politics in Chicago or whatever. And that's all fine, but that's a very narrow sliver of what corruption is historically. If you read the Bible, if you read Shakespeare or Chaucer or the Oxford English Dictionary, first of all, your reading habits are better than mine, but you'll find that corruption used to be one of these central concepts to human life. It's this idea that's captured in concepts like entropy or the second law of thermodynamics, the phrase ashes to ashes and dust to dust. This idea that nature never sleeps, that nature will always reclaim what is hers. And as the Roman poet Horace once said, you can chase nature out with a pitchfork, but it will always come rushing back in. If you take a grandfather clock and an outhouse and you put them in a field, the termites do not care that one is really nice and the other one really isn't. They will reclaim them both, because that's what nature does. And so part of my argument is that corruption, as we understand it, is actually the expression of human nature. Right? I began by saying human nature has no history. Well, what was it? Hannah Arendt, one of my favorite intellectuals, she has this great line where she says, every generation, Western civilization is invaded by barbarians. We call them children. And what she means by that is that, and she's absolutely right, anybody who's had kids knows that we come into this world with remarkable amount of preloaded software, right? We are not blank slates. When people say, oh, you need to teach people to hate, it's not true. We are born with a really generous capacity for hating. Because in our natural environment, in the wild, strangers were instantly assumed to be the enemy. They were a threat. Darwin writes about this where he says if you have two species that are cooperative, the one that works together will more likely pass on its genes, and the one that is full of open-minded individualists is most likely to get wiped out. We are hardwired with a sense of wanting to be in a tribal group, to be in a small band or a platoon, and we are hardwired to distrust strangers. Babies are born with accents. Like a French baby has a French cry. A Russian baby will have a Russian cry. We are born with this natural instinct to look at the faces of our parents and assume this is what good people are supposed to look like. And if they see people who look different, we are instinctively wired to think that they're not trustworthy or that they're dangerous. That's our preloaded software. Anyone who's a parent understands that babies come with some of this software, but that they also need updates. The updates are what we call civilization, right? If you took a baby that was born today in New Rochelle and you send it back 1,000 years to a Viking village to be adopted, right? And assuming it gets adopted, the paperwork is terrible back then. It'll grow up to be a Viking. It'll grow up to rape and pillage the English countryside because that's how it'll be raised. If you took a Viking baby and you sent it to New Rochelle, it'd grow up to be an orthodontist, right? And so whenever civilization breaks down, we revert to human nature. This is one of the reasons why I love like Walking Dead and zombie apocalypse movies and movies like Road Warrior and all the rest, is that whenever the thin veneer of civilization is torn away, we revert back to small bands of bipedal hominids foraging and fighting for food. That's the story in Lord of the Flies, right? These pinnacles of Western civilization, these little snot-nosed British boarding school kids, they're dropped off on an island 5 minutes later, they got war paint on, they got spears, they're worshiping a pagan god, all because that's how we're wired. What civilizations do is they regulate human nature. The first civilizations, the first obligation of a civilization is to regulate violence, because we are hardwired to want to be violent. We are hardwired to want to solve problems violently, and that's how we solve problems for hundreds of thousands of years. As civilizations progress, they regulate more and more parts of human nature. One of the things that is very hardwired into us is nepotism. There's never been a society anywhere in the world where people did not give preference to their family over strangers. Where they did not give preference to kin over strangers, or even friends over strangers. That is natural. Advanced democratic capitalism says that's not the way you're supposed to run things. It's okay in the private sector. I got no problem with mom and pop businesses and all the rest, but we understand that you're playing favorites when you do that. The Catholic Church struggled mightily to deal with nepotism. That's where we get the word. It comes from nepotismo, which means nephewism, because Catholic bishops and archbishops and cardinals were having affairs, and they were giving all sorts of perks and privileges to their nephews. And so you had the Catholic Church, in order to hold back human nature, implement a whole bunch of reforms to do that. The Chinese had the same problem with their they had this really efficient, wonderful system of slave bureaucrats. And one of the ways they figured they could solve the problem of human nature was by castrating them, which I'm open to that for bureaucrats today, but there's some other reforms we can try first. The Turks did the same thing. The Ottomans did the same thing with their janissaries. They stole Christian children from the Balkans and whatnot, and they turned them into a slave army called the janissaries. And they made them eunuchs too. And some of them rose very high up. I mean, you had guys, basically premiers of the Ottoman Empire were eunuch slaves, sort of like Mike Pence. And just kidding. And mostly. And but the problem again and again and again was that human nature would reassert itself. There's this thing that the evolutionary psychologists call the coalition instinct. We by nature form coalitions. We form little groups. You know, you go into prison and you all, which is sort of like a state of nature, and you need allies to fend off other coalitions. That's how we do things. And so the Praetorian Guards in Rome, the Janissaries, the Chinese bureaucrats, human nature eventually, through the coalition instinct, reasserted itself, and they formed guilds. They formed groups protecting their own self-interest. Adam Smith writes about this in The Wealth of Nations. He says, seldom were, and I'm quoting from memory, he says, seldom will men of the same trade or occupation meet, even for a party or merriment in a pub, when the conversation won't rapidly turn to a conspiracy against the public good. And what he's saying is that business people naturally want to form rackets, cartels, guilds, where they husband the resources, raise prices, all the rest, against the public good. Smith says this is unavoidable. And the remedy for it isn't trying to stamp out human nature. The remedy for it is to make sure that government doesn't give sanction or license to any of these monopolies, that you don't use the violent power of the state to say that these monopolies or these guilds or these associations have the power of law behind them. The founding fathers, who read Smith and knew all of this stuff quite well, they called this faction. And the whole point was, one of the reasons why the American founding worked was that they understood that faction was unavoidable with human beings. The trick was to make sure that no one faction, including a majority of the people, could get control of government and then use the power of government to protect themselves. And so when you look around today at all the problems that we have in our politics today, and we have a lot, what I would argue is they are reassertions of human nature. So why is it happening? Well, primarily it's because the institutions that civilize us, that turn us from born barbarians into citizens, members of a civilization, are breaking down, starting with the family. The family is in really dire shape. But also, so is organized religion. So are all the little platoons of civil society that give people a sense of belonging and meaning, give people a sense of place. Those are all breaking down too. And there are a lot of reasons for it. We can get to it in the Q&A. But the response to it for a lot of people is to retreat even further from civil society, to retreat even further from real communities, and get online into virtual communities, which are, to borrow a phrase from social science, total garbage. Facebook is great for keeping up with old friends. It is not a substitute for new friends or for real friends. And so when we retreat into these things like Twitter and Facebook and whatnot, we go to places that affirm and confirm our worst biases and treat other people as if they're abstractions. And that encourages these tribal tendencies in our society. And the other thing that happens is that as we become more atomized and disconnected from other people, Ben Sass writes about this a great deal in his new book, Them, we start looking to the state to provide, and to politics, to provide things that were normally provided by community. Some of you might remember, in the 2012 election, the Obama campaign came out with this thing called The Life of Julia, which was maybe the creepiest PowerPoint presentation in all of human history. And it was basically a slideshow that had this fictional girl named Julia, who every panel began with the words, under President Obama, and then explained how Julia got something wonderful from the state. Under President Obama, Julia gets a student loan. Under President Obama, Julia gets a small business credit. Under President Obama, one of the creepiest sentences ever offered in modern politics, until President Trump came along, was, under President Obama, Julia decides to have a child. Right? Just makes me feel unsafe, right? And the larger tech, but there were smart people behind this thing. And what they saw in the data, what they saw in focus groups, what they saw on the ground was that there are an enormous number of people who don't have families, who don't have community connections. And so they're looking to the government to provide the thing. In The Life of Julia, she has no parents, she has no friends. Her kid appears in one panel, disappears when he's 18, and never comes back. At the end of her life, she gets to work in a community garden. She doesn't even get her own garden, right? And what the Obama people recognized was that this has a real appeal. The first words, I attended the Democratic Convention in 2012 for reasons probably having to do with original sin. The first words at the convention were from a video that said, the government is the one thing we all belong to. Now, as a Tea Party-ish kind of guy, that makes me want to flip the safety on my rifle, right? But that's not what other people hear. What they hear is something we can belong to, something we can be part of. Robert Nisbet, my favorite sociologist, wrote a book called Quest for Community, in which he argued, completely rightly, it's been backed up by science now 1,000 times over, that we are hardwired with a desire to be in a community, that we need to be in a community. But when healthy sources of community are not provided for us, that instinct, that desire, that craving does not turn off. We look elsewhere for it. And so one of the reasons why our politics are so unbelievably partisan right now, one of the reasons why so many people on the right and the left are retreating to identity politics, is that they are searching for sources of meaning. They are searching for a tribe to belong to. And so, normally I would get into this whole thing about Lincoln and Locke, but I'm going to skip it because I want to get to the Q&A. And so what we live in now is in this time where we are following politics as if it's a form of entertainment. And I say that not in a sort of glib way, but in a serious way. There are some amazing things that happen to your brain when you watch entertainment. Basically, all the civilizational stuff kind of half turns off. And so you have, if you watch a movie and you like the hero, Denzel Washington, Harrison Ford, Nicolas Cage, whoever, he can torture people. He can murder people. He can wantonly wipe out people, and you still root for him. You think it's kind of awesome because you want the hero to succeed. They do these amazing tests where Paul Bloom writes about this in his book, Empathy, where they bring in a guy, and they open up a curtain, and there's a two-way mirror, and he sees some dude strapped to electrodes. And they shock the guy. And the observer, who's the real test subject, jumps, right? Which is sort of natural. When you see something terrible happen to somebody, you kind of do one of these because the empathetic part of your brain is lighting up. The part that says, oh, that could be me is lighting up. They then will say, let's say the observer is an Eagles fan. And they'll say, oh, by the way, that guy is a Patriots fan. And then they shock them. And the pleasure centers of their brains will light up. that's what happens when we follow politics like entertainment. We see that, so much of this stuff that you see today, look, Ben Shapiro's a friend of mine and all that, but I hate all of this liberal tears are delicious stuff, right? Because what is poisoning so much of our politics is this idea that something is worth doing only if it makes the other side angry or upset. I'm all in favor of making the other side angry or upset if it's a good reason to do it, right? But particularly on college campuses, there are an enormous number of conservatives, I think largely acolytes of like Charlie Kirk and that crowd, who think that simply because being an ass is un-PC, it is okay to be an ass. And so many of the defenses you get of the worst statements that come from Donald Trump are, well, look, he's making the right people angry. He's upsetting the libs. He's owning the libs, right? And you see the exact same thing going on the left. And it is incredibly poisonous and it's incredibly dangerous. We live in this era of high negative polarization. What that means is there are millions of people in America who call themselves Democrats primarily because they hate Republicans. And there are millions of people who call themselves Republicans because they hate Democrats. My wife had my favorite New Yorker cartoon, my wife had blown up and framed, put on a wall, and it's for a birthday present, and it's got two dogs drinking martinis at a bar in New York in suits. And one dog says to the other, it's not good enough that dogs succeed. Cats must also fail. And that's where our politics are going, because we are all looking to Washington to fill the holes in our soul. We're all looking to Washington to fix all of our problems. We are all assuming that all the bad things in our life are being caused by people of that other tribe, that other abstraction. And this saturates so much of our politics, and I just don't mean partisan politics. Identity politics is this idea, is an ancient idea, right? It is this idea that says people are by nature different, that by an accident of birth, some people are better or worse than other people. Well, that's what aristocracy was for 10,000 years, right? Aristocracy says that, originally aristocracy meant rule of the best. But very quickly what happened is that coalition instinct that affects, gelded slaves and rulers alike kicked in, and these people wanted to pass on their power and status, sort of like the North Koreans, to their children. And so they invented these concepts of noble blood that said some people are just born better than other people. Aristotle writes about how some people are just born slaves by nature. Other people are rulers by nature. And they pass that on to their children. One of the most radical things the Founding Fathers did was get rid of titles of nobility. We never talk about that. Because this idea that some people are born better than other people was contrary to the best principles of the American founding. Now, I'm happy to talk about how the Founding Fathers were profound hypocrites because they didn't apply that principle to slaves and women or non-property owners and all the rest. But one of the great things about hypocrisy is that you can only be a hypocrite if you have a principle. If you have no principles, you can't violate them, right? You can't be at odds with them. And it was that hypocrisy that was embedded in the American founding that took hundreds of years to unfold and is still unfolding today, that has been part of the story of how this country has gotten better by living up to its principles. When Abraham Lincoln gives the Gettysburg Address, he says, 7 years ago, our founding fathers came here based on a proposition that all men are created equal, that we are all endowed by our Creator with inalienable rights. People forget that when the Declaration of Independence was written, the beginning, that part, was basically boilerplate by Jefferson writing on a deadline. The exciting part was the end, independence. What Lincoln did is flipped it around and said, no, the really important part was that beginning. 100 years after Gettysburg, Martin Luther King marches on Washington and he says the Founding Fathers came to this country and they offered a promissory note that all men are created equal, that all men are endowed by the Creator with certain inalienable rights. He appealed to, quote unquote, white America, to the best story that Americans have told themselves about themselves and said, you're falling short. One of the things that breaks my heart these days on both the left and the right is that so many people are now saying because those ideals are inconvenient, we should get rid of the ideals. On campuses, the people used to debate how to draw the line for free speech. Now the argument is increasingly that the ideal of free speech is a tool of white supremacy, right? The idea of colorblindness is a tool of white supremacy. The idea that you should take people as you find them is, is this pernicious plot by white European pale penis people, whatever. And so what we're doing is rather than saying rightly that we're falling short of our ideals, we're saying the ideals themselves are now horrible, and instead we should give in to human nature, give in to our own corrupting sense of whatever I want, whatever I need is what I should get. And so I'll close skipping all sorts of fascinating stuff, I gotta tell you, with my favorite quote from Calvin Coolidge, praise be upon him. He wrote the second greatest thing about the Declaration of Independence, the first being the Gettysburg Address. And he said, on the 150th anniversary of the signing of the Declaration, he said, about the Declaration, there is a finality that is exceedingly restful. It is often asserted that the world has made a great deal of progress since 1776, that we've had new thoughts and new experiences which have given us a great advance over the people of that day, and that we may therefore very well discard their conclusions for something more modern. But that reasoning cannot be applied to this great charter. If all men are created equal, that is final. If they are endowed with inalienable rights, that is final. If governments derive their just powers from the consent of the governed, that is final. No advance, no progress can be made beyond these propositions. If anyone wishes to deny their truth or their soundness, the only direction in which he can proceed historically is not forward but backward, toward the time when there was no equality, no rights of the individual, no rule of the people. Those who wish to proceed in that direction cannot lay claim to progress. They are reactionary. Their ideas are not more modern, but more ancient than those of the revolutionary founders. And in this sense, Francis Fukuyama was right. We have reached the end of history. That doesn't mean we don't have progress to make. That doesn't mean we don't have problems to solve. But when you reach the top of the mountain, right, which is where we are, you can have arguments about whether we should go left towards socialism or right towards nationalism. But at the end of the day, when you're at the top of the mountain, whichever direction you start walking, the only relevant direction is down, back to where we came. And the reason why we're heading in that direction these days is because we don't teach anybody to have gratitude for what we have and the sacrifices that were made before us. Ronald Reagan was right when he said, we're never more than one generation away from tyranny, because we are not born with liberty in our blood. We have to fight for it in every generation. And that means fighting off the corrosive effects of human nature. Thank you all very much.